I wasn't prepared for the way my life would twist the day Tom Cruise walked into my world like a force of nature. I was 22, still more girl than woman, awkward in my height and my sincerity, still learning how to breathe in Hollywood's strange, glittering atmosphere. And then there he was, a star blazing at close range. When he looked at me during the auditions for Days of Thunder, it felt as if the room shifted its weight. Cameras, directors, producers, they all seemed to rearrange themselves around him. And when he smiled, the world became dangerously simple. I was the chosen one. Only later would I learn the truth. No one survives being chosen by a man who believes the universe is his to shape. Our chemistry on screen was effortless. Off screen, it was overwhelming. He was determined, charismatic, endlessly energetic. I was impressionable, hungry for real connection, dazzled by the intensity with which he lived. He told me he admired my purity of emotion, my raw talent. I felt seen, not noticing that being seen is not the same as being understood. We married quickly. Too quickly. But at the time, it felt like destiny had taken me by the hand and whispered, "Run." The first years were beautiful in the way that dangerous things often are. A whirlwind of premieres, interviews, shared film sets, long nights lying awake discussing art, ambition, family. I was certain I had married my soulmate. The world certainly believed it. But even in those early days, I felt something I couldn't name, an invisible pressure, a current always pulling in one direction, toward him. His beliefs, his rules, his circle, his vision of what our marriage should be. And then there was the church. At first, I thought it was just another Hollywood eccentricity, a spiritual community, unusual but harmless. He insisted it grounded him. It made him focused, disciplined, invincible. And he wanted me to feel the same. But very soon I sensed something colder beneath the surface. A quiet scrutiny. A constant evaluation. A need to classify people as in or out. Approval was conditional. Dissent was suspicious. Distance was dangerous. And I, polite, accommodating, hopelessly in love, tried to adapt. I didn't see that each compromise cost me a piece of myself. We struggled to have biological children. Losses. Silent grief. Conversations that left bruises. He grew frustrated. I grew fragile. When we adopted, I felt an ocean of love, but his world, his church, swelled even larger around us. I watched our home become a fortress of discipline, schedules, routines, expectations. Love existed, but it had rules. And I was beginning to suffocate quietly inside the golden cage. Still I stayed. I adjusted. I believed. Until the day a shadow entered our marriage, a woman whose name would echo through Hollywood gossip columns for years. Penelope Cruz. She was beautiful, warm, magnetic, and starring with him in Vanilla Sky. The rumors began like they always do. Whispers on set, paparazzi photos, sources close to the production. I told myself it was nothing. We were actors. Stories sold magazines. But my instincts, the ones I had buried under years of obedience, stirred. He became distant, strangely electrified, as if living two lives at once. I knew that look. I had seen it directed at me years earlier, when we first met. His laughter on the phone felt different. His energy shifted. He was present but unreachable, polite but detached. I confronted him once, gently, vulnerably, stupidly, and he brushed it aside with the kind of dismissive authority that makes you question your own reality.
"No, Nick. Don't go there."
Just that. A command. And suddenly I understood. The rumors weren't the problem. His reaction was. Because even if absolutely nothing happened, even if it was all smoke, not fire, the emotional truth remained. My husband no longer lived fully inside our marriage. But the far greater tension came not from Penelope. It came from the church tightening its grip around him. They whispered that I was a suppressive influence, that my independent streak, my questions, my hesitation to dive deeper into their practices made me a threat to his greatness. I felt their eyes on me at events, assessing, calculating, deciding whether I belonged or needed to be removed. And Tom listened to them more than he listened to me. Suddenly, decisions about our children, our home, our careers were no longer between husband and wife. They were advised, encouraged, directed. I watched him disappear into a belief system that demanded loyalty above all else. And the more devoted he became, the more invisible I felt. I remember one evening, a simple, quiet dinner, when something inside me finally cracked. He spoke about the children, about structure, about discipline, about what the church recommends, and I heard myself say, "But what do you want, Tom?" He looked at me with a calmness that felt like a door closing. "This is who I am." And in that moment I knew. He had outgrown the version of me who loved him. Or maybe I had finally outgrown the version of myself who existed for him. The unraveling was quiet, not a dramatic fight, not a scandalous betrayal. It was a slow, devastating erosion of trust, connection, and self. The rumors about Penelope didn't destroy us. They simply revealed the truth I had refused to see. I was no longer the woman he wanted, and he was no longer the man I could survive. The church wanted more of him. He wanted more of the church. And there was less and less room for me. When I finally left, it wasn't because of jealousy or fear or anger. I left because I realized something terrifying. If I stayed, I would vanish completely. Not immediately, but inevitably. So I walked away from him, from the church, from the life the world worshipped, and stepped into the unknown, trembling but alive. That was the end of our marriage. But it was the beginning of my resurrection. Leaving the marriage did not deliver the immediate sense of liberation people often imagine. In truth, the moment I walked away felt less like stepping into a new beginning and more like stepping into a cold, unfamiliar void where every sound echoed too loudly and every memory clung too tightly. I had freed myself from a life that no longer had space for me, yet I had no idea who I was without the structure I'd lived in for so long. The church sensed my absence immediately. Their initial attempts to draw me back into their orbit arrived cloaked in friendliness, warm invitations to stay connected, gentle reminders that true growth required continued commitment, and subtle warnings that distancing myself might limit my potential. None of the words were overtly threatening, yet something in their tone carried an undercurrent of ownership, as if my place beside Tom had granted them permanent access to me. When their soft tactics didn't work, the warmth evaporated with remarkable speed. The shift was quiet but unmistakable. Conversations regarding the children suddenly grew complicated. Decisions that once involved only Tom and me began to pass through advisors I had never met. Their influence seeped into our lives like smoke, impossible to grasp, impossible to ignore. People often ask why I didn't storm through those barriers, why I didn't wage a public war against the church or tear apart every obstacle that stood between me and my children. What they fail to understand is that battles fought loudly in the open are not always the battles you win. When a system thrives on division, open defiance only pushes the ones you love further into its arms. I learned quickly that the only way to stay close was to move slowly, carefully, without giving anyone reason to fortify the walls already being built around them. At the same time, the world seemed determined to assign a completely different narrative to the collapse of our marriage. The spectacle surrounding Tom and Penelope had gained a momentum of its own. Photographs of them spread across magazines as if printed on an endless conveyor belt. Tabloids wrote stories with such conviction that even I occasionally paused and wondered which parts they were inventing and which parts they believed. The truth is simple. The rumors didn't destroy our marriage, but they illuminated everything I had refused to acknowledge. They forced me to confront how deeply disconnected we had become and how desperately I had been clinging to the illusion of a bond that no longer resembled the love we had once shared. The wound wasn't jealousy, it was humiliation, the quiet kind that settles beneath your ribs and refuses to leave. Everywhere I went, strangers looked at me as if I had been replaced. Hollywood thrives on storylines, and I had become the discarded character in a plot I no longer controlled. For months, I moved through my days as though wrapped in thick, invisible fog. I accepted roles, attended meetings, and smiled for photographers, all while feeling as if I were performing a version of myself rather than living as her. Nights stretched longer than they ever had before. Mornings felt hollow. I often found myself awake before dawn, staring at the ceiling, wondering whether I would ever feel present inside my own life again. And then, without any ceremony or announcement, healing began in the smallest, most unexpected ways. One day, while reviewing a script alone in my kitchen, I realized no one was waiting to approve my choices. No one hovered behind me with suggestions disguised as guidance. The room felt strange in its stillness, but that stillness eventually turned into something sacred. I began to reclaim parts of myself I had abandoned, my instincts, my spontaneity, my willingness to take risks. I traveled without asking permission. I accepted roles because they challenged me, not because they aligned with anyone's strategic plan. With each step, I felt myself expanding again, filling the space that had been compressed for far too long. Professionally, people started saying I had entered one of the strongest phases of my career. They saw confidence, depth, and intensity on screen. What they didn't see was the emotional excavation happening beneath those performances, the way each character allowed me to process another layer of grief, anger, or fear. Acting became the language through which I rebuilt myself, piece by piece. Yet even as I found strength in my work, loneliness lingered. Fame is loud, but the spaces between public moments are unbearably silent. I longed for connection that wasn't tainted by history or expectation, someone who saw the woman behind the actress, behind the headlines, behind the past. That connection arrived when I wasn't looking for it. At a charity event, one I almost didn't attend, I found myself standing next to a man whose presence felt strikingly different from the polished Hollywood personalities circling the room. Keith Urban didn't approach me with charm or bravado. He simply introduced himself with a quiet sincerity that immediately disarmed me. We spoke first about the event, then about music, then about the strange duality of living in the public eye while trying to protect the most fragile parts of yourself. Hours passed without either of us noticing. For the first time in years, I felt I could breathe without monitoring my every word, every gesture, every silence. Keith had his own battles, his own scars, his own shadows. Perhaps that's why I trusted him more easily than I expected. There was no pedestal between us, no competition, no need to shrink or stretch to fit his expectations. I didn't have to become someone else, and that was the most unfamiliar revelation of all. But with that comfort came fear. I confessed to him, early on, that I had spent so much of my life molding myself to fit into someone else's world that I no longer trusted my ability to be in a relationship without losing pieces of myself. He listened with a stillness that felt like respect rather than judgment. Then he said something that settled into me like warm light. You shouldn't have to disappear for someone to love you. No one had ever phrased it that plainly. Our love grew deliberately, not recklessly. We moved slowly, because slow felt safer. Over time, the fear that I might lose myself again softened into something more manageable, something closer to hope. With him, I didn't feel watched or corrected or controlled. I felt witnessed. When we married, the ceremony was quiet, intimate, stripped of spectacle. I remember looking at him and thinking that perhaps this was what I had been craving all along. Not grandeur, but gentleness. Not perfection, but honesty. The birth of my daughters, Sunday and Faith, sealed a chapter one had spent years trying to write. They became my anchor, my joy, the embodiment of the freedom I fought so desperately to claim. People still ask about Tom, the church, and the past. They want bitterness, revenge, scandal. They want simple answers to complicated histories. But I don't live in those rooms anymore. I don't revisit the shadows unless I choose to, and even then, I do it without anger. I don't blame Tom. I don't blame Penelope. I don't even blame the church. Blame is a way of staying tethered to the past, and I have no desire to remain tied to a life that no longer resembles who I am. What I know now, with clarity I didn't have then, is that escape is not abandonment. Escape is choosing survival. Escape is reclaiming the parts of yourself you once surrendered. Escape is the moment you stop apologizing for needing air. Freedom didn't happen the day I left my marriage. Freedom happened the day I realized I no longer needed to defend why I left. And I will never allow myself to vanish again.